Welcome to Module 7, Validation. In this module, you will learn an overview of the validation and verification process validation planning and developmental activities, installation, operation, and performance qualification requirements, and sample size determination considerations. There will be a quiz at the end of this module. You must score at least an 80% to pass. The quiz can be retaken as many times as needed. So what is validation and verification? So this figure shows a high-level example of kind of what the overall validation and verification process is. And we'll walk through each of these in more detail shortly, but we start off with our inputs, and then those inputs are then taken through the validation process. Then we have outputs. And then as there are changes to those outputs, if they do not impact the current validated state, then there can be simple verification done. And if the changes do impact the current validation state, then you might have to go through the full validation process all over again. But we will walk through each of these in more detail now. So validation is required per clause 7.5.6 of ISO 1345. Validation is the collection and evaluation of data which confirms that a developed process is capable of consistently producing conforming product. This process usually involves equipment validation as well. And with equipment validation, that is a series of qualifications such as installation, operational, and performance qualifications that provide a high degree of assurance of the consistent expected functioning of that piece of equipment. Inputs to the process validation are typically risk assessments, design controls, process development, and process controls. And outputs of process validation are the validation reports. The validation process starts off with process development, sometimes called process characterization or PC. Process development helps to create process knowledge by demonstrating relationships between inputs and outputs. Process validation is used to design the manufacturing and testing equipment, test methods, and production processes to support the manufacturing and testing of a product. Process development also provides justification for ranges of equipment parameters and produced material attributes. Key activities in process development include identifying which inputs have significant impact on the outputs, assessing rework allowed within the process for potential adverse events, identifying challenge conditions that will result in product meeting all predetermined requirements, and identifying initial controls and monitoring requirements. We will walk through each of these in more details now. When we identify which inputs have significant impact on the outputs, we are looking at the relationship between those inputs and outputs. So inputs are items such as materials, dimensions, machine settings, environmental conditions, and this is items such as time, temperature, pressure, voltage, process repetitions, etc. Outputs are measurable process characteristics resulting from the manufacturing process. And examples of these are dimensional requirements, pull strength, electrical resistance, etc. So for design outputs that are process outputs that impact, fit, or function, they're oftentimes called critical or essential or key outputs. And these are evaluated in process validations or fully verified in production via inspection. So any features that we are deeming critical, we want to put more time and attention in the processing of those to ensure that they meet requirements. When we assess rework allowed, we want to get a better understanding of any potential adverse events that may occur by simply redoing the process. It may be something that's impactful to the product itself, or it could also be something that results in, hazardous situations for users. And then again, we want to identify challenge conditions of the process that will result in the product meeting all predetermined requirements. So challenge conditions are a set of process input parameters that are intended to be the worst case anticipated conditions of manufacturing that will still result in the product meeting all defined requirements. So the worst case is, like the very lowest of settings that we can run product at, or the very highest of settings that we can run product at, and it still all end up meeting the defined requirements. Challenge conditions must be within a qualified process window, and we should take into consideration any calibration tolerances where applicable, and again, the allowances for rework and retest. A process window is the allowed range of parameters for a process that yields conforming product, again, so the very low and then the very high, and then everything in between is kind of the nominal. The process is allowed to operate anywhere within the process window, and altogether that process window is referred to as normal operating conditions. So abnormal operating conditions are anything outside of that process window, and then that is thus likely to be an unvalidated state. It is possible to have more than one set of challenge conditions identified for each process. So when we identify initial controls and monitoring requirements of processes, there are a handful of things that we want to consider. So first, we want to consider any risks associated with the process output not meeting the specified requirements. And so some common questions to ask here, are, will a process failure result in product being scrapped, or can products be reworked? What risks will potential rework introduce? And how well can the process failure be detected? We also want to consider process capability. Capability is measured through CPK and PPK, and CPK is more of a short-term indicator, and it's regarding the potential of a process to meet specification, while PPK is more of a long-term indicator, and it's measuring how the process actually performed. Typically, a value of 1.67 or higher demonstrates good process control. A value of 1.33 is an acceptable value, and it represents a normal and stable process. But a value of 1.0 or less should require more controls, and improvements to the process should be attempted. When identifying controls, you also want to consider the effects of upstream or downstream processes. So, for example, there are some processes in manufacturing that can add or remove materials from products, such as coating or machining. And so, controls such as inspection may need to be put in place to ensure that the correct dimensions remain as the product is being manufactured. And lastly, you want to also consider controls and monitors of similar processes. Ongoing evaluation to ensure process input parameters or product characteristics are correct, and to ensure outputs continually meet specified requirements. Following the completion of validation activities is typically performed by in-process or final inspection during manufacturing. So once a process has been developed and we have taken into consideration of, all of the items that we just discussed, we can now move into process validation. So process validation is demonstrating the ability of processes to achieve planned results consistently. It is used for new or revised manufacturing processes, replicated, validated manufacturing equipment or lines, and producing devices for commercial release, technology, or manufacturing transfers. Any process change must be reviewed to determine the impact on previously completed validations prior to implementation. A revalidation may be necessary based on the results of this review, and of course, this review must be documented in the change control system. Typical process validation is not used for software that does not operate or interface with or control equipment. It's also not typically used for purchased materials or components, facilities infrastructure requirements, sterilization processes, design verification and validation, as we discussed in Module 2, test method validation or TMV, and also supplier qualification. Each of these all kind of have their own unique validation type processes that we will touch on high level shortly. So purchased materials or components are typically verified instead of validated by a C of C or C of A. and that stands for Certificate of Conformance or Certificate of Analysis, or equivalent, and that is what would confirm that the item meets specifications. And so when we purchase materials or components from a supplier, we're not going to revalidate what the supplier has likely already validated, but we do want to verify that what they have given us is accurate. And so it could be done by, again, the CFC or C of A or some other type of incoming inspection that verifies that what they have given us is accurate. And with test method validations, these are typically performed with gauge R&Rs or measurement system analyses. A measurement system analysis, or MSA, is a systematic method to identify and analyze the variation of the components of a measurement system. MSA is used as the checkpoint of data quality before we start any further analysis or draw any conclusions from the data. And then with gauge R&Rs, this is a methodology used to evaluate a measurement system, such as an instrument, and that instrument's accuracy by ensuring that its measurements are repeatable and reproducible. And this consequently defines the capability of that measurement system or that instrument to be able to be used for a specific parameter or dimension. Gauge R&Rs do use the ANOVA testing, and that's analysis of variance testing, and that is often performed in computer programs such as Minitab. Gauge R&Rs can be attribute or variable. With variable gauge R&Rs, specific measurements are taken, such as dimensions on a part. Variable gauge R&Rs measure the variation one appraiser has when measuring the same part and the same characteristics using the same gauge more than one time, and then those results are then compared to that of another appraiser. There should always be a minimum of 2 appraisers for any gauge R&R. When reviewing study results, we typically look at the percent tolerance, the study variation, and the degrees of freedom. An acceptable percent tolerance should be 10% or less. Marginally acceptable percent tolerances would be between 10 and 30%. An attempt to improve the study should be made for percent tolerances above 30%. Additionally, the number of degrees of freedom should be greater than 3. Less than 3 is typically unacceptable and should need a rationale for acceptance. However, there are some cases for very small dimensions that require a CMM, for example, to measure, that those may result in fewer degrees of freedom because it's typically harder to introduce more variability in those parts when measuring such small dimensions. Attribute gauge R&Rs are used for pass-fail type scenarios such as visual confirmation or functional tests, and calculate the percentage of repeatability and percentage of reproducibility. Ideally, both percentages should be 100%, but generally the rule of thumb is anything above 90% agreement is considered adequate. Additional approval of results should be utilized to justify acceptance of results between 90 to 80% agreement, and rationales and/or an attempt to improve the study should be made for results below 80% agreement. When planning gauge R&Rs, it's best practice to include both good or conforming products as well as bad or non-conforming products. And this is so that we can help to determine the variability in the process, to see where that variability is coming from, whether it's in the parts themselves or whether it's between the appraisers. This is referred to as part-to-part variation, and we want all the appraisers to get similar results and not have any variation there, but we do want to see variation in the parts themselves, and so it's good practice to have both the good or conforming and bad or non-conforming parts to help ensure that the method or instrument that is going to be used can pick up on both. And then, of course, before executing a gauge R&R, the measurement method chosen must be calibrated. The FDA lays out current good manufacturing practices, or CGMP, ordinances in their Code of Regulations, which describe the purpose of validation. The CGMP principles require that manufacturing processes be designed and controlled to assure that in-process materials and finished products meet any predetermined quality requirements and do so in a consistent and reliable way. The FDA QSR Part 820.70, Section A states that where the results of a process cannot be fully verified by subsequent inspection and test, the process shall be validated with a high degree of assurance and approved according to the established procedures. So to verify or validate is sometimes a question. So process verification confirms whether specifications are being met according to predetermined parameters. When a manufacturer is confronted with parameters that can't be measured, validation is then required. Process validation corroborates that intended performance yields consistent results. So processes are not usually measurable with 100% accuracy, thus to achieve the fully verified clause is not always possible. And because of this, we typically need to have process validation. And process validation is sometimes the more cost-effective option. A fully verified process typically means that the process is being able to confirm with high confidence all of the key quality attributes. And so sometimes manufacturers can do this by opting to do 100% inspection, but again, sometimes 100% inspection may not be the most costly or time consuming, and so validation would be the better option there. At the beginning of the validation process, we of course need to do planning, and so sometimes there is the MVP or Master Validation Plan, also called BMP or Validation Master Plan, and this is a summary of the validation strategy for the plan processes. The MVP outlines all the activities that must be performed to ensure that all aspects of the process are reviewed and that the validation requirements are met. If there are any changes to the strategy, the MVP must be updated with the changes approved. A master plan is used when there are multiple processes or equipment being validated. If there are not more than one item being validated, then a simple validation plan is acceptable. After a plan is drafted, subsequent individual plans or protocols can then be drafted. So again, if there's more than one piece of equipment, you have the master validation plan, and then there would be subsequent individual plans and reports for each individual piece of equipment. The execution of validation protocols provides the objective evidence and record that the plan elements were completed and that results aligned with documented acceptance criteria. At the conclusion of the validation cycle, a master validation report, or again, validation master report, MVR or MVMR, is completed. The MVR documents completion of the plan validation activities and provides traceability to documented objective evidence for the completed validation activities. And this must be completed prior to the product is being released and concludes the completion status. For validation involving equipment, there are three activities that are typical: installation qualification, operational qualification, and performance qualification. Installation qualification, or IQ, demonstrates that the tooling and equipment meets design and documentation requirements, is installed correctly, is capable of its intended use, and has the correct software installed and validated. An IQ is required for all equipment used in manufacturing, inspection, and testing of product, and is also required before equipment is released for use in operational or performance qualifications or production and must have an approved report. The IQ must be reassessed and appropriate activities repeated whenever changes are made to the equipment. For example, if equipment moves from one site to another, installation activities would need to be repeated. In the inputs to an IQ include completed and approved equipment design and documentation, such as manuals and specifications. Deliverables for an IQ include the IQ report that is approved for each piece of equipment. A single IQ plan may be written to include multiple pieces of equipment of the same model, provided that all test requirements are performed individually and documentation is clearly tied to each piece of equipment. So configurable custom software used to operate equipment must have its own software validation performed prior to or in conjunction with the IQ or in the process development. The IQ plan report requires the author to define requirements and document testing results or other verification processes used to prove that requirements have been met for key areas listed below, and that include the utility verification such as voltage, and equipment functionality verification such as the equipment starting up correctly, any applicable environmental conditions such as humidity, calibration, preventative maintenance requirements, environmental health and safety factors, software installation, and then of course the necessary um, times in which revalidation may be needed, and that should also be documented. After an IQ report is approved, operational qualification or OQ can be performed. An OQ establishes by objective evidence process parameter limits, which can result in product that meets all predetermined requirements and demonstrates that a process can produce conforming product um, at anticipated process challenge conditions. And we established what challenge conditions were a little bit earlier. An OQ is one or more production runs using those challenge conditions, depending on how many challenge conditions were identified. So when you think of an OQ, think of pushing the limits of that equipment or process. If the process demonstrates that there is no variability in the inputs that would affect outputs, and therefore there are no challenge conditions to evaluate, an OQ is not required and a rationale can be documented. And as mentioned earlier, challenge conditions are commonly called high and low or upper and lower tests during the execution of an OQ protocol, as the tests involve going to the highest or lowest point a parameter can go and still produce conforming product. Nominal or norming operating parameters lie somewhere in between the high and low challenge conditions. But once we have the OQ and we have all of the high and low conditions, while normal is in the middle, the high and the low are in the normal all together, represent the process window, and the equipment can operate at any point in that window. After the OQ is approved, a performance qualification or PQ can be performed. A PQ is establishing by objective evidence that the process, under anticipated conditions, consistently produces a product that meets all predetermined requirements. A PQ usually consists of 3 or more runs at their normal operating conditions, depending on the variability of the process, to demonstrate that the process can consistently meet all requirements. So again, we have the high and the low, and then we have normal and somewhere in the middle. And so the PQ is typically the nominal in the middle. OQ and PQ are not required for processes whose outputs are fully verified. And so again, fully verified outputs are process outputs that are 100% confirmed by subsequent inspection or test. And so prerequisites include the MVP or equivalent, and approved manufacturing operating procedures, IQ reports, process development, completed test method validations, evidence that personnel have been trained, 2 applicable manufacturing processes and test methods, approved risk assessments or equivalent, and materials and components that are traceable. Repeating full validation studies for the same processes offer no new knowledge or protection. Thus, existing validations can be leveraged for processes that use new and/or replacement equipment that will be used to produce the same product with the same operating window and control and monitoring strategy. So if you have equipment that is a replicate of existing equipment, you can use whatever validation plans and protocols that have been established for that equipment instead of going through the whole process validation or process development phase all over again. Additionally, revalidation of existing equipment may be needed if equipment is moved, repaired, has components replaced, etc. The existing protocol can simply be re-executed in these events. For OQs and PQs, it is sometimes necessary to sample parts for conformity, especially for high-volume equipment or processes. Sample size determination is based on statistical rationales. Valid statistical rationale has the following requirements, and that is the identification of associated risks, the appropriate protection level, and that's the confidence level or conformance level / the reliability level, And so for things that are deemed serious, that's 95 to 99%. Confidence, for moderate, it's 95, 95. And then for little or no risks, it might be 95, 90. And then also you need to choose the analysis method and required sample size to demonstrate that level of confidence. And so inspection should follow an acceptable quality limit or AQL in order to align with the chosen risk protection. And so with serious, typically an AQL of 0.65 or better is required. For moderate, an AQL of 1.0 or better is required. And for little or no risk, an AQL of 4.0 or better would be required. And ultimately, all of this type information should be documented in a sample size or statistic procedure. And then this also should be documented in any associated validation plans or protocols. And that brings us to the end of this module. Be sure to review all applicable procedures and form templates that RUC has related to the requirements listed in this module. And of course, when preparing documents for our clients, be sure to customize them to what the organization actually engages in. Before moving on to the next module, be sure to take the Module 7 quiz. And remember that you must score at least an 80% to pass and that the quiz can be retaken as many times as needed.